Hello guys, welcome back to our session. We're gonna wrap up today the Epic of Gilgamesh in preparation for next week's reading of the Odyssey. Now, last week we left off, on Tuesday we left off at the part of the epic where Gilgamesh and Enkidu set out to kill Humbaba, right? In a sort of act of defiance in pursuit of this aesthetic mode of life and pleasure, right? And we talked about the dilemma of Gilgamesh. We talked about how Gilgamesh, as a result of him being so self-absorbed and egoistic, he was not able to engage in self-reflection. Therefore, he could not discover himself. Right? He was living in a world of distractions. And we talked about how Enkidu and to an extent Gilgamesh were transformed through the relationships that they had, right? What we can call the authentic relationships. And these are relationships that can be described by the I-thou relationship. The relationship in which man is not, or the other is not reduced to a object, but is seen as another person, right, who is distinct and real and deserves and to whom we are responsible and so forth. Now, the problem with Gilgamesh is that despite having been now in a relationship with Enkidu, he is still self-absorbed. And so the gods have to come up with a new strategy. So now what happens is that Enkidu falls ill, right? The gods make it a point that Enkidu falls ill. Now, Enkidu, as he is dying, right, he curses Shatham, right? He curses her because through her and through the relationship with her, he became self-aware, right? So he became aware of his impending death, and he lost his animal-like innocence, right? Remember how we said that becoming self-aware and becoming fully human is a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, we have the joys of thinking and the joys of pursuing truth and so forth, and being moral beings. And on the other hand, it creates a sense of alienation and a sense of awareness. Now here in particular, it is awareness of death, right? It is awareness of death. So it's as though Enkidu was trying to imply that ignorance is bliss. It would have been better if I was not aware of the reality of death. Okay. And shortly before he finally dies, he tells Gilgamesh about the so-called afterlife that he has a vision of. And he tells Gilgamesh, not only is death inevitable, but that there is nothing after death, right? So this is a very important point, okay? And it will become clearer as we proceed to the next text. Not only does Enkidu reveal the reality of death, but he also reveals for Gilgamesh the meaninglessness of life and death, right? So for example, what's the relationship between meaning and death? Clearly, for, let's say, a Christian theologian who believes in an afterlife, death means something that is radically different than Enkidu or Gilgamesh, for whom there is no blissful afterlife. In fact, Enkidu actually tells Gilgamesh that the afterlife is literally the house of dust, right? It does not matter what you do, what your deeds are. It is just a house of dust. It is a nothingness. So the meaning and the value that we attribute to death is based on the idea of what happens after death and whether or not there is meaning to life. So after Enkidu dies, suddenly Gilgamesh is forced to encounter a new reality, right? And he does not encounter this reality purely because through just knowing, right? But he experiences the reality of death. He does not read about it, he experiences it. So if you want to, again, like we said in the first lecture, that experience is when something is imposed onto you. It is when it's almost like when somebody pokes you, right? You do not ask to be poked. You do not ask to become aware, right? But when someone pokes you, you are inevitably turned towards that person or turns towards that reality because he has come to you. So death and experience comes to and imposes itself on our poor friend Gilgamesh. Now, Gilgamesh is left with the realization that the universe has no answers, right? As we explained through Enkidu's revelations. And that the universe is meaningless in the sense that it is indifferent to Gilgamesh. It does not care about the well-being of Gilgamesh. For example, when I want to print something, right? The printer does not take into consideration my well-being, right? When it jams or when it loses ink, it doesn't do so out of spite. And when it does work, it does not do that out of altruism, right? Quite simply, it does what it does because it is governed by certain laws, so to speak. So similarly, the universe does not care about Gilgamesh's suffering, therefore it cannot provide him any kind of solace or comfort. So he cannot seek comfort outside of himself, right? In the face of death, right? So he begins to question the meaninglessness of life. And he asks himself, and he tells himself that what happened to Enkidu is bound to happen to me. That is to say, he enters a state of anxiety. That anxiety rooted in the realization that life is inevitably moving towards death. So what is this death that we speak of? One second. Okay. So in the face of his impending doom, Gilgamesh decides to seeks out defiance. Okay, he decides to be defiant in the face of death. One second, let me just rearrange this. So now, having faced death and meaninglessness, he initially comes to think, okay, if there is no meaning in the afterlife, right, and if death is the finality of this world, then I must seek out immortality, right? I must seek out the suspension of death, which is to say the suspension or the negation of his own human condition. And so he sets out to meet a god that is known to be immortal. Immortal meaning does not die. Utna Pishtim. And again, when he confronts this God, he comes to realize that this God is very much similar to him, right? And yet he has the element of immortality. So again, we have an encounter in a relationship that is also transformative, right? So Enkidu is left asking the question, Gilgamesh is left asking the question, what is it about Utnapishtim which allows him to be immortal? Whereas I, 2/3 God and 1/3 human, am not immortal, right? Here he is asking, he is trying to inquire about the human condition. Now, there's a part that I left out. So prior to setting out to meet Utnapishtim, on his way, right, he comes across an old lady. And this old lady, she was in a tavern. She warns him. She says, and of course she feels sad for Gilgamesh. So she says, okay, I'm going to give you an alternative, right? An alternative to the despair and the dread that you have on the one hand, and eternal life on the other. Why? Because eternal life, as she says, is an impossibility. So she advises him, she says, the eternal life you are seeking, you shall not find. When the gods created mankind, they established death for mankind and withheld eternal life for themselves. As for you, Gilgamesh, let your stomach be full. Always be happy day and night. Make every day a delight. And then she ends by saying, night and day, play and dance. Now, essentially what she is telling him, enjoy what you have while you have it, right? And this is something which would have resonated with Gilgamesh had he met her before the death of Enkidu. But now the force of the transformation that he has undergone and the reality that he has experienced with all of its consequences has completely distracted him from an aesthetic life, a life of pleasure, right? He is in a state of shock, so to speak. So it's very similar to telling someone, for example, who is in battle, right? A soldier in battle, telling them, and in the heat of the conflict, telling them that they should seek out the pleasures of this life. Clearly, that is not what is on the soldier's mind. In the same way, pleasure, play, and dance is not on the mind of Gilgamesh. His anxiety overwhelms his carnal desires, right? His animal-like desires that had defined him up until now. So anyways, as we said, he goes back to Utnapishtim, and Utnapishtim essentially tells him, look, okay, there is nothing that you can do about the reality of death. This is the first thing. And he tries to, I believe I don't remember if it's a male or female, tries to distract him by telling him a story about mankind. But again, Gilgamesh cannot settle for that story, right? He is distracted. He still is dealing with the reality of death. Okay, 1 second. So finally, Utnapishtim realizes, okay, this guy is not going to give up. So she gives him a test. Okay. She says, look, there is a plant that is hidden at the bottom of the sea. Okay. And it can bring relief to your anxiety because it postpones death. Remember, note here that even this plant, right, it cannot negate death. It can only postpone death. So it is a sort of extension period, kind of like when you take an exam, your professor was to give you an extension. Clearly that's different than giving you an A, right? Or canceling the exam, right? In both cases, you are still bound to the state of being a student. You have not escaped your status of a student. So similarly, what Utnapishtim says is like, look, you cannot escape the human condition. But what we can try to do, and of course she knew that Gilgamesh would ultimately fail in this test, that what we can try to do is to postpone the inevitable. And so Gilgamesh now has this new climax. He has this new sense of hope. And he sets out to discover this plant, and he truly does discover it. And interestingly, when he is given the second test, right, which is in some of the narrations of this book, it was a test, and in other narration, it was not a test. It was just Gilgamesh's own act. But he is told to try to stay awake and not sleep. I believe it was for 7 days and 7 nights. Now, clearly, what this test seeks to establish or make Gilgamesh aware of is his limitations. In other words, the gods are trying to demonstrate that not only can Enkidu not escape death, but he cannot even escape minor death, which is sleep. So in the Arabic tradition, for example, or in the Islamic tradition, there's this idea of the minor death, which is sleep, and the major death, which is your biological death, right? And so similarly, many ancient civilizations perceived sleeping to be a form of minor death. And so what the gods are trying to show Gilgamesh after he gets the plant and he sets out to his city, right, that even your human condition even prevents you from achieving, from overcoming this minor death, let alone allowing you to achieve a immortal life, i.e. escaping major death, which is, as we said again, the biological death. So what happens is he ends up falling asleep, and in one of the most tragic scenes of literature, one of the most anticlimactic scenes, a snake snatches the plant and takes it away. A snake takes away the plant from the mighty king Gilgamesh. Now, clearly, we have this up until now, this the fact that Gilgamesh, right, or that this text is a text about tragedy. It's a very tragic text. Why is it tragic? Again, because it is rooted in a particular conception of meaning about the universe. But as we will see, that even a tragedy will furnish us with some meaning, right, which we will see. So then Gilgamesh falls into a state of depression. Okay. Now, this state of depression, it is a phase, right, where he goes about wandering. It is the stage that one enters when they come to the realization that, well, at least for Gilgamesh, that life is meaningless. Life is meaningless. Okay. So the first stage, after having realized the meaninglessness of life, is that state of depression and loss, the state of anxiety and displacement, right? However, one of the most important philosophers that conceptualized death and sought to understand death and meaning, Friedrich Nietzsche, makes a very interesting claim. He says that in the face of death, in the face of meaninglessness, given that the gods have not given you meaning and life has not given you meaning, then the only recourse, the only option is that man creates meaning for himself, right? So in the absence of higher meaning, right, and in the face of impeding death, and in the face of an impersonal universe, right, man should break out of the state of depression and loss and instead map out his own meaning and his own future. So we find in the conclusion that Gilgamesh comes to realize this when he returns to Uruk, right? And in returning to Uruk, as he approaches the city, he discovers what his own meaning is, right? At that moment, he's able to create meaning for himself. And he comes to realize that my meaning is not in anything that is individualistic or something that is egoistic, such as my own immortality or my own power, but rather it is in my commitment to the people of the city, right? It is in my ethical being and my putting and the state in which I put myself at the disposal of the other, right? Now, why is this important? And how does he come to realize this? Because as we said earlier, right, Gilgamesh and Enkidu only undergo transformations through relationships, right? Transformation does not occur at the level of the individual. Transformation occurs at the level of the collective, at the level of the I and thou, right? So Gilgamesh comes to realize that the meaning that I must create for myself, right? Yes, I must create it, but it cannot emerge solely and exclusively for me. Because in reality, my existence forces me into a relationship with the other. So Simone de Beauvoir, who is one of the most brilliant existentialist philosophers, she says, since the individual is defined by his relationship to the world and to other individuals, he exists only by transcending himself, right? For example, his desires and his ego. And his freedom can be achieved only through the freedom of others. He justifies his existence by a movement which, like freedom, springs from the heart but leads him outside of him. Again, so for Gilgamesh, this is from the outside are the people of his city. Man is free, but he finds his law in his very freedom, the ability to make a choice, right? Because the whole question of what is my meaning and creating a meaning for myself would be pointless unless we had the capacity to choose, the freedom of choice. So first, we must assume his freedom and not flee from it. He assumes it by a constructive moment. One does not exist without doing something, and also the negative movement which rejects oppression for oneself and for others. So true authenticity, right? True authenticity comes in two critical moments. The first, like de Beauvoir is trying to show us, is that we have a choice, right? We can choose what type of life and what type of trajectory we can live, right? And it's because we have choice that we can try to come up with our own understandings and grounds for meaning. The second realization towards authenticity is that this choice and this meaning cannot be separated from my relationship to the other. right? My relationship to the other is what we say, an ontological characteristic. It is a feature of the self, a feature of the human condition that you cannot negate or eliminate. In the same way, death is an ontological characteristic of man that you cannot escape or try to postpone. So one of the important themes, and we'll end with this, is what is the relationship between death, choice, and meaning? Clearly, if death is viewed in this tragic lens, then would that not mean that instead of seeking out meaning, we should alternatively fall into a state of depression, for example? And in the face of death, intuition would tell us, right, that instead of now searching for a purpose, man must resign himself to the fact that there is no purpose. Of course, this is in the views of the ancient Sumerians. So why and how does the reality of death actually help us move towards authenticity? There are three reasons for this. The first is that it is not death per se that transforms an individual, right? Because when death occurs, the individual is no longer there, right? He is negated, right? What the text, I believe, is trying to allude to, and this is what several existentialist philosophers sought to explain, is that when we speak of death, we are speaking about the awareness of our death, right? So there's a difference, for example, between taking an exam and the awareness that you have about that exam in the days prior to it, right? Your awareness of it forces you to act in a particular way. The second reason that it is part of our, that it leads to authenticity, is because when we come to acknowledge and become aware of death, we also engage in self-discovery, because we come to discover something that is essential to our human condition, right? We come to discover one of the characteristics that make humans human, right? And third, and most importantly, that the awareness of death is a prerequisite to the realization of one's freedom. So let me give you an example of this. Okay, in the very famous text show Breaking Bad. Okay, so in Breaking Bad, right, you have this character, I believe Hank, who prior to his cancer diagnosis lives a very much distracted life. He does not live a life of reflection or self-discovery, right? He is actually a chemistry teacher at a high school and does side jobs, right? His whole concern is essentially the mundane, everyday world. Now, when he falls ill and the doctor tells him that you have terminal cancer, he becomes aware of his impending death. And this awareness, if you have watched the show, right, fundamentally transforms all his actions, right, and his trajectory, right? Why? Because the reality of death forces us to come to terms with the power of choice, right? When we are facing impending death, right, we become aware of the fact that the choices that we make are significant, right? So it's kind of like somebody knowing that they are going to die, let's say in 6-7 months. Clearly, their choices are going to be different for example, they are going to begin thinking about certain possibilities that they had not realized. For example, taking a vacation, or how much time I spent on family versus work, and so forth. So Heidegger explains. Heidegger is also an existentialist philosopher, and this is in the dictionary of existential terms. He says, they say, in describing this, in Heidegger's account, a full existential awareness of death places the contents of one's life in a properly finite and first-person perspective. Only by the anticipation of death is every accidental and provision possibility driven out. Once one has grasped the finitude of one's existence, it snatches one back from the endless multiplicity of possibilities. Again, this is a complex way of saying that it is only when we anticipate death do we come to the sense of urgency with regards to the choices that we have. And in the face of death, we come to the realization that of our own limited freedom, because we come to realize, okay, I could have done such and such. Or instead of working 12 hours, I can work 4 hours. Or instead of, for example, obeying arbitrary law, as in the case with Hank, right? I have the capacity to disobey law, right? So new possibilities emerge when death forces us to become aware of our capacity to choose, and gives us an urgency to seek out new possibilities. So the idea here, remember we said earlier that death is in many ways seen as a tragedy, and the meaninglessness of life is seen as a tragedy. What the text is trying to tell us, in addition to some of the existentialist philosophers that we just explored, what it is essentially telling us is that death, in addition to the relations that one has with man, right, is in and of itself part of the pursuit of authenticity, right? And so what we want to get out of this text is the fact that for the ancient Sumerians, and as we will see later on, and for our other heroes in the text, the authenticity, right, and the human condition is fulfilled only, and it becomes authentic only when, one, it occurs in relation, one is in relation with the other, right, in a reciprocal relationship with the other, and two, when one becomes aware of death, because awareness of death creates awareness of one's freedom, i.e. one's capacity to choose. So next week, inshallah, we will look at the Odyssey of Homer, and we will take up a new theme then. We will delve more deeply into the issue of choice and the issue of freedom.